Hello everyone, welcome back to AV Chess Lab. Online chess is back with the Opera Euro Rapid as part of the Magnus Carlsen chess tour. In round 1, we're going to cover the game between Wesley So with the white pieces and Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, with the black pieces. Wesley has had the upper hand lately and Magnus is coming off his worst tournament in over a decade. So let's see what happens here. We have e4, c5, knight f3, d6, and Magnus has been playing this knight dwarf variation lately with mixed results. Wesley continues with bishop to b5 check, and this is the Sokolsky variation. Bishop d7, bishop captures, queen captures, and c4 by Wesley. And this is the main idea. You trade the light square bishop, but you get this very strong hold on the square on d5. Magnus continues with a developing move with knight to f6, also putting pressure on the pawn on e4, and Wesley of course develops his own knight and protects his pawn on e4. After g6, Magnus intends to fianchetto his bishop to g7 and castle kingside, a normal setup in this type of structures. d4 by Wesley, trying to open up the center of the game. C takes d4, knight takes d4, and Magnus continues with bishop to g7, and f3 by Wesley. A very useful move. You put some extra protection on the pawn on e4, but most importantly, now you're preparing to go bishop to e3. On the previous move, if bishop to e3 directly, then knight to g4 can come in and attack the bishop. Magnus here castles, Wesley goes for bishop to e3, rook to c8, putting pressure on the pawn on c4. Wesley goes for b3, knight to c6, Wesley castles, queen to d8. A very interesting maneuver here by Magnus. He wants to bring his queen to a5, from which he'll attack the knight here on c3. And also notice that this bishop on g7 can also put indirect pressure on the knight on c3. Queen to d2, queen to a5, rook f to d1, and here knight to d7. According to my database, this position has been reached 7 times, with 6 wins for black and 1 win for white. No draws. So Magnus must have been feeling very optimistic about his chances here. Here Wesley continues with the new move, knight d to e2. Magnus goes for a6, a common move in these situations. You go for a6 and you plan some b5 break in the future. Also sometimes they go for e6, d5. a4 by Wesley. He wants to restrict this advancement of the pawn on b5 at all cost. e6 by Magnus. Now he goes for the other break since a4 was played, not allowing b5. And here rook a to b1 is played. So how come this pawn on d6 cannot be captured? Well, for starters, if the pawn on d6 is captured, then you can simply take here on c3, knight takes on c3, queen takes on c3, and when the queen takes on d7, we capture this other bishop here on e3 with check. So for that reason, the pawn on d6 at the moment is not really hanging. Wesley goes for rook a to b1 as we mentioned, rook to d8 by Magnus, and bishop to g5 by Wesley, putting pressure on the rook on d8. Magnus continues with rook to e8, and Wesley responds with bishop to f4. And again, how come the pawn is not hanging? Well, the same situation happens. If queen captures on d6 here, then we go queen takes on g5, and after queen takes on d7, we throw in this check. The king moves, and we go bishop takes on c3, knight takes on c3, queen takes on c3, and we come a piece ahead here. So coming back into the game, Wesley goes for bishop to f4, attacking the pawn on d6 with the bishop. Magnus responds with knight to e5, and h3 by Wesley. And again, I ask the same question. How come queen takes on d6 is not possible? If the queen captures on d6 here, then after rook e to d8, the queen is trapped, it has nowhere to go. So for that reason, Wesley decides not to go for this. Instead, h3 is played, rook a to d8 by Magnus, protecting the pawn, king to h2 by Wesley, queen b4 by Magnus, putting some added pressure to, putting some added defense to the pawn on d6. Wesley continues with bishop to g5, attacking the rook. So now if the rook moves, we can actually capture the pawn on d6. f6 had to be played by Magnus. Bishop to e3, and knight to f7, putting some added protection here on d6. f4 by Wesley, expanding on the king side. f5 by Magnus. E takes f5, g takes f5, knight to d4, and Magnus finally is able to break through in the center with d5. Pawn takes on d5, pawn takes on d5. Now this rook on the e file is going to have some very good prospects. Bishop returns to g1, and Magnus is able to play knight to d6, and is eyeing this very juicy square here on e4. Queen to d3, putting some pressure here on this pawn on f5 with both the knight and the queen, and Magnus blocks that with knight to e4. And at this moment, although Magnus was doing very poorly early, his position is actually very safe right now. Knight from c to e2, knight captures, bishop captures, knight captures. And out of nowhere, it seems as though Magnus has allowed this knight to f2 or even knight to c3 with a fork winning an exchange. Knight to f2 doesn't work because of queen to g3 check, and we're just going to pick up the knight on f2 on the next move. And if knight to c3, we have queen g3 check, king h8, the knight captures on f5. Now there's a mate threat here on g7. Rook to g8 has to be played, attacking the queen and protecting against the checkmate on g7. And after queen to f2, and knight takes on b1, rook takes on b1, Wesley has plenty of counterplay for the sacrifice exchange. But considering what happened in the game, Magnus should have gone for this variation instead. Instead of knight to c3, Magnus goes for king to h8, and from this moment on, he starts going in the wrong direction. Wesley continues with rook b to c1. Now knight to c3 is no longer possible, and Wesley is also trying to infiltrate into the opponent's camp with rook to c7. Magnus stops that by going queen to d6 himself, putting pressure on the pawn on f4 and also protecting against the rook coming into c7. Queen to e3, putting the queen in the same path as the rook. Very ballsy by Wesley, I must add, and also putting some protection against the f4 square. Magnus continues with knight to g5, a discovery attack on the queen with the rook. Wesley continues with queen to f2, and after knight to e4, queen to h4, the queen had transferred itself to the h file, and now there's some potential checkmate ideas there. Magnus has to protect the pawn on f5 with the rook, and after rook to c2, Magnus here plays a very bad move, queen to g6, and the idea here is that now the rook can come into c7, so he shouldn't have allowed that to happen. He's trying to get some counterplay down the g file, trying to checkmate the white king, but as you will see, it is him that actually gets checkmated instead. Rook to c7 by Wesley, taking the opportunity. Magnus goes for rook to g8, threatening checkmate of his own here on g2. Wesley protects with rook to g1 and rook to c8 by Magnus, trying to penetrate also with this rook down the c file. Rook captures on b7, and Magnus goes for rook to g3. And this looks very scary actually if you first look at this position, but Wesley had calculated everything. The threat here for Magnus was to go rook to g3 followed by rook takes on g2. But Wesley does not allow that to happen, and he goes for knight to e6. A very strong move. For starters, if the queen captures knight, we go queen takes on h7 checkmate. The knight from e6 here is also planning to go to g5, from which now the pawn on h7 is going to be hit with 3 pieces, and it will be game over for Magnus. After knight to e6, Magnus goes for rook to c2. Wesley blocks with knight to g5 and hitting everything on h7. Magnus has to go for rook to g7, and after this trade here, Wesley, although has given away some of his advantage, is fully in control. And here Wesley goes for king to h1. And his main idea is to try to take advantage that the king and queen are on the same file, and he wants to open up with g4. Magnus, of course, does not see this, and he doesn't anticipate the threat and goes for king to g7. He should have gone for king to f7, and this would have offered him a lot more chances to draw the game. Instead, after king to g7, g4, he has to sidestep the pin with king to f7, wasting a move. And now that Wesley opens up the position, the game just suddenly ends with after queen takes on f5, rook to g5, and notice that this queen has nowhere to go, has no checks, and is the only piece protecting against the pawn on h7. And if that pawn falls, the black king is going to get checkmated very soon. Here Magnus goes for some tricks with rook to c1 check, and as long as Wesley doesn't step into a dark square, he should be fine. More checks happen, he goes there, and after rook to c2 check, Wesley goes for king to e1, and here the game is over. Rook to c1 check here, he just goes king d2, he's going to be attacking the rook, and the queen is also being threatened, so it's game over. A devastating start by Magnus as he continues to lose, but if someone can come back, it's him, and I am sure he will return and get some victories in this tournament. Thank you everyone for watching, and as always, stay safe, have a great day, and show respect to your opponent. See you next time.